The ice storm had been raging for 3 days when the sky broke open with fire and light. Commander Scytheral gripped the edges of her control panel as the rescue vessel, Mercy's Wing, tumbled through the frozen atmosphere of Kion 4. A world so cold that her species had marked it as death zone on every star chart they possessed. Engine 2 is gone. Her pilot screamed, his thin fingers dancing across controls that no longer responded to his commands. Engine 3 is failing, and we are losing altitude fast. The ship shuddered and groaned like a wounded animal as it plunged through clouds, made of ice crystals sharp enough to cut through metal. Scytheral turned to check on her crew. 3 Valorians huddled together in the back of the bridge, their delicate exoskeletons already showing hairline cracks from the dropping temperature inside the vessel. Her people were not built for cold, and the heating system had failed 20 minutes ago when the first engine exploded. For the Valorians, anything below 15 degrees was considered dangerous, and anything below 0 was a death sentence. The external sensors showed the surface temperature of the world below them, -45 degrees. "Commander," her communications officer whispered through chattering teeth, "I have found something on the surface. There is a settlement, a mining outpost, and the inhabitants are responding to our distress signal." Hope flickered in Scytheral's chest for just a moment before dying again. "What species?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. "Humans, Commander. The settlement is a human mining colony called Outpost Sigma 7. The bridge fell silent, except for the screaming of wind against the failing hull. Humans, the species that the Galactic Union had classified as Category 3 developing, barely worth noticing, too primitive to be considered true spacefaring people. The species that built ugly ships and used crude tools, and somehow thought they could survive on worlds that would kill any sensible being. "We have no choice," Scytheral said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling through her bones. "Send them our coordinates and tell them we need immediate rescue. We have maybe 40 minutes before the cold kills us all." The Mercy's Wing hit the frozen ground with a sound like thunder, sliding across ice and snow for nearly a kilometer before finally coming to rest against a ridge of ancient frozen rock. Inside the broken ship, Scytheral pulled herself up from where the impact had thrown her and looked around at her crew. They were alive, but barely curled together for warmth, their breathing shallow, their skin turning the pale gray color that meant death was coming. The temperature inside the ship was now -20 degrees and dropping fast as heat escaped through cracks in the hull. She tried to move toward her crew, but her legs would not obey her commands. The cold had already begun to shut down her nervous system. "This is how we die," she thought, on a frozen rock at the edge of known space, waiting for help that cannot possibly arrive in time. The nearest Valorian ship was 3 weeks away, and no species in the galaxy could survive outside in this weather long enough to reach them. Then she heard something impossible voices outside the ship, and the sound of heavy machinery moving through the storm. She dragged herself to the viewport and wiped away the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass. What she saw made her wonder if she had already died and was experiencing some kind of fever dream. Humans were walking through the blizzard. Not running, not struggling, not dying, just walking, as if -45 degrees was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. They wore thick suits of insulated material, but their faces were exposed to the wind, and they were talking to each other and pointing at her ship and moving with calm purpose. One of them climbed onto the hull of the Mercy's Wing and began attaching cables, while others guided a massive tracked vehicle into position. "They are outside," Scytheral whispered to no one, because her crew had lost consciousness. "They are outside in the death cold and they are not dying. How is this possible?" The human on the hull looked down through the viewport and saw her watching. He smiled and gave her a gesture with his thumb pointed upward. She did not know what it meant, but something in his void expression told her it was meant to be reassuring. Then he pressed his face close to the glass, and she saw his breath fog against the frozen surface. "Hang tight," he shouted through the hull, his voice muffled but somehow still warm. "We have got you, just stay calm, and we will have you inside in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. They thought they could move her entire ship in 10 minutes, while standing in weather that should have killed them instantly. The tracked vehicle roared to life, and Cicero felt the Mercy's wing lurch as the cables went tight. The humans were dragging her ship across the ice toward a cluster of buildings barely visible through the swirling snow. She watched through the viewport as more humans emerged from the outpost, directing the operation with hand signals and shouted commands that she could not understand. They moved with efficiency and confidence, as if rescuing alien ships from frozen wastelands was something they did every week. The hangar doors opened like the mouth of some great beast, and warm air rushed out to meet the killing cold. Inside, she could see lights and tools and humans in work clothes waiting with medical equipment and thermal blankets. As the Mercy's wing was pulled into the hangar, Cicero felt the temperature begin to rise and saw her crew start to stir. The last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her was a human face peering through her cracked viewport, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes and grease stains on her cheeks. The woman pressed her palm against the glass and nodded slowly, as if making a promise. "Welcome to Sigma 7, the woman said, a voice somehow carrying through the damaged hull. "You are safe now. We take care of our guests here, no matter where they come from." Cicero wanted to respond, wanted to ask how these primitive humans had done the impossible, wanted to understand how any species could treat the death cold as nothing more than an inconvenience. But the warmth was pulling her down into darkness, and the last thought she had before unconsciousness took her was a question that would haunt her for weeks to come. Who are these humans, and what else can they do that the galaxy does not know about? The answer to that question would change everything. Elena Vasquez stood in Hangar Bay, with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the alien ship that had been dragged in from the storm 3 hours ago. The Mercy's wing looked like it had been through a war hull, panels cracked and bent, one thruster completely shattered, strange fluids leaking from pipes that glowed with colors Elena had never seen before. Behind her, the medical team had already taken the alien crew to the clinic, wrapping them in every thermal blanket the outpost possessed and pumping warm fluids into their strange bodies. The lead doctor had said they would survive, though it would take days for them to fully recover from the hypothermia that had nearly killed them. Elena did not care much about the aliens right now. She cared about their ship. She had been the chief mechanic at Outpost Sigma 7 for 6 years. And in that time, she had fixed mining equipment that companies had declared beyond repair, rebuilt atmospheric shuttles from scattered wreckage, and once kept the entire outpost heating system running for 3 weeks, using nothing but spare parts and creative thinking. But she had never seen anything like this vessel. The design was beautiful in a way that made her heart ache, smooth curves where human ships had hard angles, flowing lines that seemed to dance with purpose and intention. Even damaged and broken, the Mercy's wing was a work of art that made human engineering look crude and primitive by comparison. "Do not waste your time," said a voice behind her. And Elena turned to see Station Chief Monroe walking toward her with a tablet in his hands. "I just got word from the Galactic Union, a certified Valorian repair team will arrive in 3 weeks to assess the damage and determine if the ship can be saved." 3 weeks, Elena repeated, her voice flat. "That is the protocol," Monroe said with a shrug. "Alien technology is not something we are supposed to touch. The Union has rules about this kind of thing, and breaking them could cause problems for the whole outpost." Elena turned back to look at the ship and felt something stubborn rise up in her chest. "The heating system in that ship is completely dead," she said. "If we leave it sitting here for 3 weeks in a hangar that barely stays above freezing, The damage will get worse, fluids will freeze and expand, seals will crack, and whatever is left of the electronics will corrode from the moisture in the air. Monroe sighed and rubbed his forehead with one hand. Elena, I know that look in your eyes, and I'm telling you right now that this is not a good idea. We do not have schematics. We do not have compatible parts, and we do not understand how any of this technology works. So I will figure it out, Elena said simply. You cannot just figure out alien engineering. Monroe protested. The Union classifies Valorian technology as too advanced for human comprehension. There are probably components in that ship that operate on principles our scientists have not even discovered yet. Elena walked toward the ship and ran her hand along a damaged hull panel, feeling the strange smoothness of the alien metal beneath her calloused fingers. Chief, she said, without turning around, do you know what I see when I look at this ship? A very expensive piece of equipment that we are absolutely not authorized to touch? No, Elena said, and she finally turned to face him with fire in her eyes. I see an engine that needs fixing. I see broken parts that need replacing and damaged, systems that need rebuilding, and a machine that wants to fly again but cannot do it alone. She pointed at the shattered thruster hanging loose from the port side of the vessel. That right there is a propulsion system. I do not care if it runs on quantum flux or unicorn dreams. It still has to push this ship through space. And that means it follows the same basic principles as every other engine ever built. Monroe opened his mouth to argue, but Elena was already walking toward her tool station. And those cracks in the hull? She continued, grabbing a diagnostic scanner and a heavy toolbox. Metal is metal, chief. It bends and breaks and can be welded back together. Whether it was forged on Earth or grown in some alien factory on the other side of the galaxy. The Union will not be happy about this, Monroe warned. The Union is 3 weeks away, Elena shot back. And by the time they get here, this ship will be ready to fly. I am not going to let a beautiful machine like this die, just because some bureaucrat says I am too primitive to understand it. She hauled her equipment toward the Mercy's wing and began setting up work lights around the damaged areas. Monroe watched her for a long moment, his expression caught somewhere between frustration and admiration. You really think you can do this? He finally asked. Elena climbed onto the wing of the alien ship and looked down at him with a grin that held no uncertainty at all. Chief, I once rebuilt a fusion drill using parts from a coffee maker and a broken refrigerator. This is just a bigger puzzle with shinier pieces. Monroe shook his head slowly, but Elena could see the corner of his mouth twitching toward a smile. Fine, he said, but when the Union inspectors arrive and ask what happened, I'm going to tell them you threatened me and I had no choice. Fair enough, Elena agreed. She turned to face the alien ship and cracked her knuckles, feeling the familiar excitement that always came when she had a new challenge to conquer. The Mercy's wing loomed above her, broken and silent and waiting. All right, beautiful, Elena whispered to the ship. Let us see what you are made of. I promise I will be gentle, but we have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it. She opened her toolbox and pulled out a wrench, a scanner, and a notebook. Somewhere in the outpost clinic, Commander Citharal was waking up from her hypothermic sleep, still believing that her ship was beyond salvation. She had no idea that a human mechanic with grease under her fingernails and stubbornness in her heart had already decided to prove the entire galaxy wrong. The real work was about to begin. On the first day, Elena mapped every system she could find. She crawled through access panels that were not designed for human bodies, squeezed into maintenance shafts that left bruises on her shoulders, and traced power conduits with her fingers when her scanner could not read the alien frequencies. The Mercy's wing was more complex than anything she had ever worked on, but complexity did not scare Elena. It only made the puzzle more interesting. By the end of the first day, She had filled 3 notebooks with diagrams and observations and questions that she would need to answer before she could begin the real work. On the second day, she started on the hull. The cracks were worse than she had thought, spreading through the alien metal like frozen lightning. She did not have Valorian alloys to patch them, so she fabricated new panels from mining-grade titanium and shaped them to fit the curved surfaces of the ship. The welding was tricky because the alien metal behaved differently than anything she had worked with before. But after burning through 2 welding tips and singeing her eyebrows twice, she figured out the right temperature and technique. Commander Sitharal appeared in the hangar on the 3rd day. She was wrapped in thermal blankets and sitting in a wheelchair that one of the medical staff was pushing, but her eyes were sharp and alert as she watched Elena work. "What are you doing?" the alien commander asked, her voice carrying a strange harmonic quality that made the words sound almost like music. Elena looked down from her perch on top of the ship and wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Fixing your ship," she said simply. Sitharal stared at her for a long moment, as if waiting for the punchline of a joke that never came. "That is not possible," the commander finally said. "Valorian vessels can only be repaired by certified guild engineers using proprietary equipment. The systems are far too complex for anyone else to understand." Elena shrugged and went back to welding. "I understand them well enough," she said. "You cannot," Sitharal insisted. "Our engineers train for decades before they are allowed to touch a ship like this. You are a human. Your species has only been in space for a few centuries, and you do not have access to our technical databases or training matrices." Elena finished her weld and climbed down from the ship to stand in front of the alien commander. "Let me show you something," she said, and she led Sitharal over to her workbench where the shattered remains of the port thruster were spread out in organized rows. "This is your thruster," Elena explained, pointing at the pieces. "It is very advanced and very elegant and uses principles that I do not fully understand, but look here. This component focuses energy, and this one channels it, and this one regulates the flow." She picked up a broken piece and held it up to the light. "The shape tells me its function, and the function tells me what I need to build to replace it. I do not need to understand the theory behind your technology. I just need to understand what each part does and figure out how to make something that does the same job." Sitharal watched as Elena set down the alien component and picked up something she had built herself, a crude metal assembly that looked nothing like the original, but somehow captured its essential purpose. "You made that?" the commander asked. "From parts I pulled out of 3 broken atmospheric shuttles," Elena confirmed. "It will not be pretty, and it will not be efficient, but it will work, and working is all that matters right now." For the next 3 days, Sitharal returned to the hangar every morning and stayed until the medical staff forced her to leave. She watched Elena perform miracles with nothing but hand tools and determination. When the alien diagnostic panels displayed error codes in a language Elena could not read, she traced the power flows manually with a multimeter and found the problems through pure deduction. When she needed to seal ruptured coolant lines, she tested 7 different adhesive compounds until she found one that would bond with the alien materials. When the reactor core began venting exotic particles that made her radiation detector scream in alarm, she built a containment patch out of lead sheeting and ceramic tiles and installed it while wearing a hazmat suit she had modified for the purpose. "This is impossible," Sitharal whispered to her second officer when he came to visit on the 5th day. They watched Elena hammer dents out of a quantum flux manifold with a rubber mallet, adjusting her strikes based on the sound the metal made until the component rang with a clear tone that meant it was properly aligned. "She does not have our tools or our training or our knowledge," Sitharal continued. "She should not be able to do any of this. The Union classified human engineering capabilities as primitive. But this woman is rebuilding systems that our own experts would struggle to repair. Her second officer was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Commander, I have been watching her work for 3 days now. I think I understand something about humans that we did not know before. What is that? They do not accept impossible, he said. When they see a problem that cannot be solved, they do not stop. They just refuse to believe that the word impossible applies to them, and then they find a way. On the 6th day, Elena did not sleep at all. She worked through the night, connecting systems and running tests and making adjustments based on feedback that her jury-rigged instruments provided. The sun was rising over the frozen horizon of Kion IV when she finally stepped back from the reactor housing and took a deep breath. Moment of truth, she whispered to herself. She reached out and pressed the activation sequence she had decoded through trial and error. The reactor hummed. It was not a perfect sound. There were rattles and vibrations that would have made a Valorian engineer wince, but it was the sound of power flowing through systems that had been dead for a week. Elena laughed out loud and pumped her fist in the air. Behind her, Commander Citharal sat in her wheelchair and felt tears running down her face. She did not know if she was crying from joy or from the realization that everything she had believed about humans was wrong. Perhaps it was both. The Mercy's wing was alive again, rebuilt by a human mechanic with nothing but spare parts and stubbornness. And now came the real test. The morning of the test flight was clear and cold, with temperatures hovering at -38 degrees under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Elena stood in front of the Mercy's wing and felt a strange mixture of pride and terror churning in her stomach. The ship looked better than it had any right to look after what she had put it through, hull patches gleaming dull silver against the original pale blue metal. Replacement components visible as darker shadows beneath the repair panels, and handwritten notes in permanent marker labeling systems she had modified. You should not be the one to fly it, Chief Monroe said for the 5th time that morning. We can send a drone up first, or wait for the Valorian pilot to recover enough to take the controls. Elena shook her head without taking her eyes off the ship. If something goes wrong, I need to be there to fix it. I know every modification I made and every system I touched. And no drone or alien pilot is going to understand what needs adjusting when the problems start. You mean if the problems start, Monroe corrected. No, Elena said quietly. I mean when this ship is held together with improvised parts and creative solutions. And there will be problems, but I can handle them if I am in the pilot's seat. She started walking toward the ship, but a voice from behind made her stop. I am coming with you. Elena turned to see Commander Citharal walking toward her without her wheelchair, her steps slow but steady, her eyes burning with determination. Commander, you are still recovering, Elena protested. The doctor said you need at least another week before. I know what the doctors said, Citharal interrupted. But this is my ship and my responsibility, and I will not let you risk your life alone on a vessel that belongs to my people. The alien commander stopped in front of Elena and looked her directly in the eyes. You saved my crew from the cold, and then spent 6 days rebuilding a ship that everyone said was beyond repair. The least I can do is share the danger with you. When we see if your work holds together. Elena studied the alien's face for a long moment, reading the stubborn set of her jaw and the fire in her strange golden eyes. Fine, she finally said. But I am flying. You can work the communications console and tell me if anything sounds wrong with the engines. They climbed into the Mercy's wing together, Elena helping Citharal up the boarding ramp when her recovering legs threatened to give out. The interior of the ship was cramped and unfamiliar, designed for Valorian bodies that were taller and thinner than human anatomy. Elena had to sit at an awkward angle in the pilot's seat, her legs stretched out to reach pedals that were slightly too far away, her arms reaching for controls that were positioned just wrong enough to be uncomfortable. This is going to be interesting, she muttered, as she ran through the startup sequence she had decoded. The reactor hummed louder, and the control panels lit up with alien symbols and warning indicators that Elena had learned to interpret over the past week. Multiple system alerts, Citharol reported from her station. The ship is complaining about unauthorized modifications and incompatible components. Tell it to file a complaint with management, Elena said with a grim smile. We are going up. She pushed the throttle forward and felt the ship shudder as the engines engaged. The Mercy's wing lifted off from the hangar floor, wobbling slightly as Elena fought to understand the unfamiliar flight controls. Through the viewport, she could see Monroe and a crowd of outpost workers watching from behind the safety barriers, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Landing gear up, Elena called out, transitioning the forward thrust hold on. This might get bumpy. The ship shot forward and climbed toward the open hangar doors, ice and snow swirling around the hull as they punched through the boundary between the relative warmth inside and the killing cold outside. Warning lights began flashing across multiple panels. Port thruster is running hot, Citharol reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. I see it, Elena said, adjusting controls with quick, precise movements. The replacement components are not as efficient as the originals. I need to reduce the load on that side and compensate with the starboard systems. The ship shuddered and groaned as she made the adjustments, but slowly the warnings began to fade from critical red to cautious yellow. They climbed higher, breaking through the cloud layer that perpetually shrouded Kaon IV. And then suddenly they were above it all, surrounded by stars and darkness and the endless void of space. Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and allowed herself a moment to simply look at the universe spread out before her. We made it, Citharol whispered, her voice full of wonder. We are actually flying. Your repairs worked. Do not celebrate yet, Elena warned, though she could not keep a smile from spreading across her face. We still need to test the maneuvering systems and the navigation computer and make sure everything holds together for the return flight. She spent the next 2 hours putting the Mercy's wing through every test she could think of, sharp turns that stressed the hull patches, acceleration burns that pushed the rebuilt thrusters to their limits, even a brief faster-than-light hop to make sure the jump drive still functioned. There were problems along the way, a coolant leak that Elena fixed with emergency sealant, a navigation error that required manual recalibration, a terrifying moment when the artificial gravity flickered and nearly sent them both floating into the ceiling. But Elena handled each crisis with calm efficiency, her hands never shaking, even when the ship screamed warnings at her in a language she could not understand. When they finally landed back in Hangar Bay 4, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Monroe was the first one to reach the ship as the boarding ramp lowered, his face split with the biggest smile Elena had ever seen on the usually serious station chief. You did it, he shouted. You actually did it. You flew an alien ship that was supposed to be impossible for humans to operate. Elena climbed out of the ship on shaky legs and took a deep breath of the cold hangar air. I did not just fly it, she said. I fixed it first, and honestly, the flying was the easy part. Behind her, Commander Citharol emerged from the ship and looked out at the crowd of cheering humans. She had spent her entire life believing that humans were a primitive species barely worth noticing, a backwater civilization that the Galactic Union rightfully ignored. Now she knew the truth. These people were something special, something the galaxy had underestimated, and the universe was about to find out just how wrong it had been about humanity. Chief Vasquez, Citharol said formally, using the title with respect that Elena had never heard from an alien before. I believe I owe you a debt that my people do not have words to describe. Elena turned to look at the alien commander and shrugged. You do not owe me anything, she said. I am just a mechanic who fixed a broken ship. It is what I do. But they both knew it was so much more than that. 3 weeks after the crash, the Galactic Union repair vessel descended through the ice clouds of Kaon V, with all the ceremony and self-importance that the Union was famous for. The ship was enormous, a gleaming white monument to alien technology that made the buildings of Outpost Sigma 7 look like children's toys. From its belly emerged a delegation of 12 officials, Valorian engineers in pristine uniforms, bureaucratic observers from 3 different species, and a senior inspector whose chest was covered with medals and certifications. Chief Monroe greeted them at the landing pad with diplomatic pleasantries and guided them toward Hangar Bay 4, where the Mercy's wing waited. "I must warn you," Monroe said as they walked. "The situation with the damaged vessel has changed somewhat since we first reported the crash." The senior inspector made a dismissive gesture with one of his upper hands. "We received your preliminary report. The ship was badly damaged, and your people provided shelter for the survivors until proper assistance could arrive, which is exactly what protocol requires from a Category 3 settlement." "Yes, well," Monroe said, struggling to keep a smile off his face, "there have been some developments since that report." The hangar doors opened, and the Union delegation stopped in their tracks. The Mercy's wing sat in the center of the bay, fully powered, running lights glowing softly, engines humming with barely contained energy. Commander Sitharal stood beside the ship in her restored uniform, her crew arrayed behind her in perfect formation. And next to them stood Elena Vasquez, still wearing her grease-stained work clothes, her arms crossed and a satisfied expression on her face. "What is this?" the senior inspector demanded, his voice rising with shock and what might have been anger. "This is your rescue vessel," Monroe said calmly. Fully repaired and ready to fly, Chief Mechanic Vasquez completed the work 6 days ago, and Commander Sitharal has confirmed that all systems are operational. The delegation erupted in chaos. Engineers rushed toward the ship with scanning devices. Bureaucrats began shouting into communication devices. And the senior inspector stood frozen in place, as if his brain had simply stopped working. For the next 3 hours, the Union team swarmed over the Mercy's wing like insects on a carcass. They scanned every modification, analyzed every repair, examined every improvised component that Elena had installed. Elena followed them around and answered their questions with patient professionalism, explaining her reasoning and describing the techniques she had used. The engineers grew quieter and quieter as the inspection continued, their expressions shifting from skepticism to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. Finally, the senior inspector called his team together in the corner of the hangar, and they spoke in hushed tones for nearly an hour. When they emerged, the inspector walked directly to Elena and stopped in front of her. "Chief Mechanic Vasquez," he said, and his voice had lost all of its earlier arrogance. "I must ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly." "Go ahead," Elena said. "You had no access to Valorian technical databases?" "None. No training in our engineering principles. Just what I figured out by looking at the ship. And you performed these repairs using only the equipment available at this mining outpost?" Elena gestured at her workbench, still covered with tools and spare parts and hand-drawn diagrams. "Mining equipment, salvage shuttle components, and whatever else I could find that seemed like it might work." The inspector was silent for a long moment. "Several of your modifications," he finally said, "demonstrate engineering solutions that do not exist in current Valorian design philosophy. Your hull reinforcement technique distributes stress more efficiently than our standard methods. And your thruster calibration achieves thrust ratios that our engineers considered theoretically impossible." Elena blinked in surprise. "I just did what made sense," she said. "I was not trying to improve anything. I was just trying to make it work." "And yet you did improve it," the inspector said, "without meaning to, without training. Without even understanding what you were accomplishing. You simply looked at our technology and found better ways to make it function. He turned to address Chief Monroe and Commander Citherall together. My report will recommend immediate reclassification of the human species from Category 3, developing to Category 1 observer status. This is the largest single jump in classification history. But the evidence is undeniable. Commander Citherall stepped forward and produced something from her uniform pocket, a small medallion, made of pale blue metal inscribed with flowing alien script. Chief Vasquez, she said formally, this is the Valorian Medal of Exceptional Service and has never before been awarded to anyone outside our species. But my crew and I are unanimous in our belief that you have earned it. She pressed the medal into Elena's grease-stained hand and closed her fingers around it. You saved our lives twice over, Citherall continued. Once when your people pulled us from the cold, and again when you refused to let our ship die. My people will not forget this debt. Elena looked down at the medal in her hand, feeling the weight of the alien metal and the meaning of what it represented. I just did my job, she said quietly. No, Citherall replied. You did something far more than that. You showed the galaxy what humans are truly capable of when they refuse to accept impossible. 2 months later, the first human engineers arrived at the Galactic Union Technical Academy to begin training, alongside species that had been traveling the stars for millennia. The Academy had never accepted humans before, but the inspector's report had changed everything. Elena did not go with them. She had been offered positions at a dozen different Union facilities, but she had turned them all down. Someone has to keep Sigma 7 running, she told Monroe when he asked why she was staying. And besides, I have gotten kind of attached to this frozen rock. But she did accept one invitation. Once a year, she traveled to the Valorian homeworld to teach a special seminar for their engineering students. The class was called Practical Problem Solving, under impossible constraints, and it was the most popular course at the entire institution. Her students learned to look at problems differently, to question assumptions that everyone else accepted, to believe that impossible was just a word that had not met the right mechanic yet. And every time she stood in front of a new class of alien engineers, Elena thought about a frozen night on Cayenne 4 when she had decided to fix a ship that everyone said could not be fixed. She had not known then what she was starting. She had not known that one decision, made by one stubborn human mechanic in a cold hangar on a forgotten ice world, would change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. But that was the thing about humans that the Union was only beginning to understand. They never waited for permission to do the impossible. They just did it anyway, and the universe would never be the same.